Hello, thinkers. Let's talk today about what we're going to be getting into for the rest of this week, probably going on into the coming weeks. In the previous few sections, we've talked about what arguments are, the parts of arguments, how they work, how they function. We've even worked on reconstructing arguments so that we can better understand others' arguments. But ultimately, our goal is to evaluate arguments. So that's really what we're finally getting into in this first section. One way to evaluate things is to tell when they're good. Another way is to tell when they're bad. So this unit, we're focusing on bad arguments. Now, the fancy academic term for a bad argument is a fallacy. But again, that's just a term that means bad argument or flaw in reasoning. Now, what we understand from our first few sections is that there are really only two considerations, kind of three, for when an argument is good. One is that the premises are true. And the second is that the premises lead to the conclusion. So these two things right here are pretty much, well, we'll add the third, which is that it be non-circular. That's what it needs to be good, is to be non-circular. So it's really these three considerations, usually one of these two, that are at issue for every fallacy. So you may have had a class before that studied fallacies, but every issue that you run across will be one of these two, sometimes this, as far as the flaw that's occurring. It's either failing to have a premises that lead to the conclusion, or it's failing to use a true premise, or it's circular. Now, the reason we study these is because there are certain errors that happen pretty regularly in people's reasoning that are similar in type. So even though we know that there's probably 1,000 or 10,000 ways that an argument can fail on one of these counts, there are certain ways that arguments fail when you're in public dialogue or a discourse with somebody that are really common. And I think the reason that they are really common is because they use rhetorical devices that tend to be persuasive. If you'll recall, one of the goals, or the goal of good critical thinking, is not necessarily to be persuasive. I mean, we hope that a good argument, when presented, is persuasive, because the good argument should indicate that the conclusion is likely to be true. And since we want to believe true things, we should be persuaded by a good argument. But that's ultimately not the goal, because you can persuade even if with a bad argument. So the goal is truth, and not necessarily persuasion. But what a lot of things that happen in language can do is persuade people even when the argument's bad. So these types of things that happen regularly get a nice academic name. Usually it's a Latin name so that you can sound really smart when you say it. And so then when you recognize that that error in reasoning is occurring, rather than explain the full-blown error, you can just give the name for that error, and people who know what you're talking about can say, oh yes, well, there's that flaw in reasoning. A couple things I just want to highlight that we need to be very careful about. First, let me just talk about my goals for you. My goal for you is that once you're out in life as a good, well-trained critical thinker, is that you'll be able to first recognize when arguments or when people's reasoning is good or bad, that you'll be able to tell the difference. That you'll be able to look at an argument and say, that's a good argument, or look at a bad argument and say, that's a bad argument. So that's my first concern for you. Second concern, and very closely related, is that you can understand why an argument is good or bad. So that it's one thing to say, I think that argument's bad, but it's even better when you can say, here's why it's a bad argument. Here's the problem that's occurring that makes it such that I shouldn't accept the conclusion on the basis of this argument. Really, it's a third, and I don't know, maybe there's even other issues that are more important, but it's later down the list that it matters to me that in your life, you could name a fallacy by type. You could say, aha, that's the such and such fallacy. I mean, if you could say, that person's argument's bad because it's creating this, it's doing this, and as a result, the premises don't actually lead to the conclusion. It's got a name, I remember it from class, but I don't remember what it is. That'd be great with me if you're to that point later on in life that you can recognize why arguments are bad, even if you can't name them. However, since this is a class and we have vocabulary for all of these things, you will be tested on knowing the names, because that's how we will refer to certain problems. But I really want you to understand when the argument is bad and why. And similarly, I'll just point out that sometimes if all you're doing is focusing on kind of the trigger or the red flag events that are happening in an argument or a dialogue and then calling out a fallacy of a certain type, you run the risk of calling something a fallacy when it's not. Pretty much for every fallacy we're going to discuss or to read about in this section, there is a way that an argument could do what you're on the lookout for, and yet still be a good argument. So just as an example, when we study the ad hominem fallacy, an ad hominem fallacy is when you make a charge against a person, maybe usually against their character, in such a way that's irrelevant to the conclusion. So the problem that's occurring in an ad hominem fallacy is that you're citing things that don't lead to the conclusion, but those character flaws or those character problems that you're drawing out still tend to persuade people to agree with you and disagree with the person that you're charging has bad character. Now, a lot of times that's irrelevant, and if that's irrelevant to the conclusion, then it's a fallacy. But maybe you are talking about something such that a charge about the person's character is relevant to the conclusion. Just as an example, maybe the charge is that Senator so-and-so has bad character, they've cheated on their taxes, they've done this and that and the other, therefore they should not be on the ethics committee in the Senate. Okay, now it is a challenge against the person's character, but it's relevant to whether the conclusion is true. So by knowing what the fallacy is, but knowing why it's a problem, you can then more appropriately assess whether the fallacy is occurring. All right, we're gonna discuss a few of these, a handful of these actually, over the course of this semester using this particular textbook. If you've ever studied fallacies before, there's a good chance you've used different names and terms for some of the things we're gonna discuss. Totally fine. Again, my concern for you is that you understand the problem, not just that you can give the name. Secondly, if you get onto a fallacy website or something like that, you'll see they'll have lists of hundreds and hundreds of fallacies. We're just going to discuss some of the most common ones, and I really want you to become good at recognizing when they're occurring and again, why it's a problem. One last thing, which is another thing that people can do when they study fallacies, and they just, I don't know, some people find it enjoyable to recognize problems and arguments and call out fallacies by name, but really the dialogue just ends up being a name calling. Oh, you're committing this fallacy, and then you walk away from the conversation as if that was all there is to do. There is such a thing as the fallacy, which is when you recognize that an argument is a fallacy, you thereby conclude that that person's conclusion was false. That is not justified by recognizing that a fallacy has occurred. When you recognize that an argument is fallacious, all you can say is that we shouldn't believe what they're arguing for on the basis of the argument that they're making. Their conclusion might still be true, but you just need a different argument to support it. It doesn't mean that they're wrong, it just means that the argument they're making is bad. So be careful that you don't just point out that something's a fallacy and then conclude that their position is bad or their conclusion is false. That would be the fallacy. What we do recognize though is that maybe we need to be fair and charitable and reconstruct the argument in a different way, see if there is a good argument that can be made, but ultimately if it's a bad argument, it's just a bad argument, and we hope to be able to recognize it as such. All right, so good job today. We'll be doing a few more things in the quizzes and stuff to test your ability to recognize the fallacies as you've learned about them from the textbook. Certainly if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.